Hi, this is Paul, and I have a video today that's a little different. As many of you know, this is my personal video channel, and I not only do videos about Jordan Peterson or John Vervaeke or Tom Holland or all the other the nuns, the Rets and Links of the world. I do videos like the Freddie and Paul Show and videos of our meetups, and sometimes videos that pertain to my day job, which is a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. And today's video is sort of like that, where we've got two ministers, well, we've got three, but I'm sort of a moderator on this panel, two ministers from the Christian Reformed Church in North America, from British Columbia, and two ministers from the Reformed Church in America from British Columbia. And we're going to talk about some of what's happening in both of our respective denominations. And so I'm going to leave it to Andrew. Andrew's been on my channel quite a while ago. We talked about Jordan Peterson. And I'll leave it to Andrew to introduce everybody else. I'm going to give a little bit of background in terms of the history of the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church in America, just for context. And then we'll turn to the Reformed Church in America guys to explain what's been happening in their denomination. So Andrew, why don't you go ahead and introduce everybody who's with us today.
Okay. Thanks, Paul. Good to see you again and good to be together. Yeah, I'll begin with my CRC colleague, Ed Gerber. There he is. Ed pastors a church in Langley, British Columbia called Willoughby CRC. So he's in a separate classes from mine. I'm in classes BC Northwest. Ed's in classes BC Southeast.
And a classis
is a region of churches, a
Okay.
collection of churches within a region. Yeah. So, and then also a good friend and colleague, Sandeep, who is with the Reformed Church of America, and actually in my city in Burnaby, British Columbia. We're almost next door neighbors. And then he pastors New Life Community Church in Burnaby. And Murray Moerman is also ordained in the Reformed Church of America. Currently, he's not in parish ministry per se, but he's certainly active in denominational stuff, works with Outreach Canada as well. So, so two of us, CRC, two RCA, yeah. And I'm from New Westminster Christian Reformed Church in Burnaby, British Columbia. So.
All right, where we will be on our meetup, Lord willing, not too long from now. But
that's right. Andrew
can't be there, so he's still allowing us to use his church for the meetup, which I really appreciate.
Yeah.
I want, just for the sake of context, I wanted to give a little bit of history of these two denominations. Both of these denominations come out of the Dutch Reformed history. The Reformed Church of America is one of the oldest European institutions in the New World, because the Dutch obviously were early colonists and they brought their church with them. The Reformed Church of America is the heir and counterpart, in a sense, of the old state church in the Netherlands. And in the 18th century, there were a couple of splinter groups, one called the Afscheiding, in a movement called the Afscheiding, and the other the Doleantie, and I'm sure I'm butchering the Dutch because I don't know any. And these groups led to a little tiny break-off church that was the Reformed Church, or is known as the Christian Reformed Church. That's sort of the history of these two groups. Now, one of the interesting things that happened in terms of Dutch emigration towards the end of the 19th century, even though this little splinter group, which was the Reformed Church in the Netherlands, was small in comparison to the large state church, a disproportionate number of people of that split-off group emigrated to North America. And that's part of the reason the Christian Reformed Church grew. And then later immigrants who came from the Netherlands might have been members of the state church. Many of them joined the Christian Reformed Church, partly because the Dutch language continued to be maintained in many of those churches. And they found the Reformed Church in America churches rather American. And so there's a long history there. But what has really happened, especially since the end of World War II, there was a second wave of Dutch immigrants. some new Reformed Church of America churches were planted. And so the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church in America have both coexisted, and over the last number of years actually done quite a few things together. We've merged certain mission organizations, we've merged certain benefit organizations, I myself have been in charge of running various joint programs in my region between the two denominations. The denominations are a bit distinct, however, because the Christian Reformed Church tended to be historically a little bit more doctrinally self-conscious, whereas the Reformed Church of America both had some very old churches which would look very mainline-ish on the East Coast, some very experimental churches on the West Coast, such as Robert Schuller's Crystal Cathedral, that was actually Reformed Church of America, and then also some churches that were more similar to the Christian Reformed Church. So the Reformed Church of America had quite a bit more diversity in terms of the types of churches than the Christian Reformed Church had. Yet in the last 30, 40 years, there's been a high degree of commonality between them, especially certain segments of the Reformed Church of America. So I just want to sort of set the table in terms of the two denominations. Now, was I fair to both sides in that description? And here's your chance to rebut anything in there before we get into it.
Paul, if I might just highlight three differences between the denominations historically that caused the original split. One had to do with Christian education. Christian Reformed Church said, let's educate our own kids in Christian schools. The Reformed Church said, let's go with public schools. Second had to do with Masonic temples. Can we have secret societies and be members in good and regular standing? Christian Reformed Church said, no, you can't. Only the Lordship of Jesus, no competitors. The Reformed Church took the wrong side on that question.
You just gave it away by calling them the Reformed Church.
I did indeed. And then the third had to do with communion, whether communion is open or closed. And the Christian Reformed Church said, if you're not a member of the church, you should introduce yourself to the elders before you take communion. The Reformed Church said no. So those are the three presenting issues at the time. This goes back a long ways, and there's a lot of differences since then, of course.
Very true. Very true. Thank you. So what's been happening in the Reformed Church of America over the last few decades that has brought us to this conversation?
Well, I'll start, and Sandeep, just swing in anytime you like. Essentially, the Reformed Church historically has had conversations about the appropriateness of homosexual behavior and the definition of marriage and those kinds of things for quite a number of decades. And its position on paper has been biblically orthodox and I think healthy and true. What began to break down was the ability of the denomination to hold to its own standards. And so as some classes begin to look the other way in terms of homosexual behavior among clergy, and then same-sex marriages and the like, there were many of us who said, this is a matter for church discipline, the fourth mark of the church. We need to be able to maintain our own standards. Essentially, I mean, it's just like if we have a plumbers guild and we can't hold just to plumbers, we're going to, it's going to be electricians and carpenters and airline pilots. At some point, everyone needs to be able to self-define themselves and maintain those standards. And we believe the fourth mark of the church does that. When it became apparent that we had denominationally either something wrong with our structure or the will to self-define ourselves and hold ourselves to those standards, or something else was wrong, and we were becoming more and more diverse in practice, even though not on paper, yeah, there's a lot of detail. You know, I can send you a link to a website that outlines what happened each year. It's a good summary of statements, of arguments, of overtures, of how they were responded to, and so on, to bring us to a place where it started to become apparent that we were not going to be able to live together with this. And in that, a Vision 2020 team was formed. They were asked to propose some way out. Should we try to stay the way we are? Should we allow for gracious separation of people who are on one side of the issue or another? And that committee will report this summer at the General Synod, if coronavirus doesn't cancel General Synod. The way it looks is that a large number of biblically orthodox churches will leave the denomination, and that led to conversation: where are we going to go? Our BC Classis has made plans to depart, but to depart you need a home, and that led to, among other things, it's not the only thing on the table, but conversation with the Christian Reformed Church in that regard. So maybe I should stop at that point for now. Sandeep, what would you like to add, or are we good?
Well, just that BC Classis decided a few years ago that we will find a pathway forward should the denomination not address this issue in a way that our Orthodox position is clearly defined and held on to. Then BC Classis will start preparing and have like a 5-year plan. I think we are in a 3rd year, Murray, right now?
Yes, I think so.
And so there's a small ad hoc committee. I'm part of that. And it's just to see, we kind of also are now waiting to see what happens, what comes out of Vision 2020. A few years ago, there was another special council held on human sexuality, and actually nothing came out of that. Whatever suggestions were made at the General Synod, nothing really got implemented. And so last year, when the Vision 2020 team was formed and asked to look at possible scenarios, and they've come up with 3, there's a possible 4th one, but in all likelihood, it seems like wanting to keep, in a sense, a diversity of theological opinions, which some of us feel actually it's practically very unstable. You can't have multiple competing moral visions, and so the BC Classis is going ahead with looking at through the ad hoc committee, what are the possible options out there for us where we can retain some of the essentials of the Reformed tradition, and maybe even possibly find a new home as a whole Classis. One of the things that many of us don't want to see is just a splintering happening, which is why one of the suggestions that came out of BC Classis was a possible orderly exchange of churches or things like that between the Christian Reformed Church and the Reformed Church in America, or even some way of finding networking with like-minded churches in our kind of sister denomination.
What do you think would be wrong with having a denomination where, for example, what has happened in the Christian Reformed Church in terms of women serving in ecclesiastical office, different local churches, different classes sort of go their own way. I know in the RCA for a while, you had something similar to the Christian Reformed position, but then you got rid of the conscience clause. And I know that was that churches could no longer, let's say, could no longer prohibit women from serving in local office. Why do you think sort of the big tent approach is no longer tenable for your denomination?
Murray, I think you're muted.
Thank you.
There you go.
Yeah. Well, ultimately, because being male and female is a part of the creation order, and we could have some debate about appropriate roles for men and women in ministry and continue to be committed to the scriptures, to the church, because it's a part of creation order. When we come to matters of homosexual behavior, I believe it counters, most what we have called heresy in the past has been focused on the New Testament and doctrine, but I think this counters the creation order, and that it makes family, as it's been defined as a foundation of society, untenable, and the role of women in the church is a different class and order of conversation and issue than is sexual expression and definition of marriage.
So the RCA has basically been having there's been a lot of stuff going back and forth over a number of years. Can you discipline a classist? To what degree? Who gets to decide whether this is something that we can hold differently, so on and so forth. Now, recently, there have been a number of congregations that have been talking about perhaps not even waiting or not even waiting for synod this summer, and have stated some conditions. Does that play a role in this conversation? And why doesn't your classist just say, oh, we're just going to take off with these other RCA churches that are looking at just sort of leaving the denomination? Why consider joining a denomination like the Christian Reformed Church that, while generally speaking is a bit more conservative than the Reformed Church of America, we also are having a conversation in Synod 2021 about a report which will come out about human sexuality in the family?
Sandeep, I've been doing most of the talking, so anytime you want to, why don't you lead out?
Well, I think one of the reasons is, like in our ad hoc committee, we are looking at what are the different options there. What is it again that you want to retain in terms of your Reformed Church in America heritage, and what is it that is in a sense negotiable if you have to move into a different denominational home or a network. And I think that's why for many people, and I don't count myself in that because I didn't grow up in the Christian Reformed Church or the Reformed Church in America. But for many people who've grown up in the denomination and have generations, they still have that sense of endearment to that very Dutch Reformed tradition. And for some people, the hesitation is not so much of what they're seeing, where the denomination is heading, and even though they may disagree with where it's heading, it's grieving the loss of the past, and which is where finding a connection with a sister denomination maybe in some ways eases that sense of loss for some people. There is no guarantee in any denomination that this issue will not come up again and again and again, right? Like for you, it will you will have some discussion next year, I believe, on this. But I think in terms of definition, Right now, Murray, you can correct me if I'm wrong, we do not have it as a constitutional binding statement that marriage is only between, or biblical marriage is understood as only between a man and a woman. It's not, in a sense, a binding confession. And I think the clause was removed some years ago because it was just understood that marriage is between a man and a woman or something like that. So I think trying to find a home where there is some kind of a confession of this moral vision that stands as a given, where pastors who have that conviction don't have to then keep dealing with infighting within a local congregation, or so this big tent idea, in a sense, can be seen that, oh well, we are functionally diverse, but it really doesn't work, because in a sense, if our summary of our Christian faith is who God is and who we are, and how then should we live in the light of that, if we are saying there are different ways of living morally, then we are saying there are different ways of being who we are, and then there are different ways of us interpreting God and ultimate scriptural vision. As I said before, then there are multiple competing visions under the one tent, almost counter-working with each other, because this goes to such, the issue goes to the core of who we are, and goes back to the creation order, as Murray said. So that's where I think looking for a home where there is a given that's based on the historical, biblical, and I would add global confession of the church. Often in these conversations, the global perspective is just missing. It's a lot around what's happening in the West or North America. And much of the global church is not even considered, even though that is moving now into our neighborhoods. 200 and the 2016 census says there are people identify themselves with 250 ethnic origins in Canada in terms of ancestry. And none of this is given thought in some of these conversations of what does the global church hold on to. And much of the global church holds on to a historic biblical view of human sexuality. So I think that, for me, the one tent with heterodox views on human sexuality doesn't solve the issue. It only creates further divisions, confusion between a local congregation and maybe even within families in the congregation. And the pastor has almost nothing to fall back on and has to kind of always be in conflict if the denomination says, well, all these different views are valid, then there's nothing a local congregation can fall back on.
Okay. Well, you CRC guys, you've been waiting patiently. So, these guys in the RCA have a problem. What does that have to do with you?
Yeah. Well, probably in some sense, it feels like maybe we're looking in a crystal ball a little bit and seeing our future. Maybe, we look at the RCA and there are some in the CRC that wonder, is this where we're going? As a denomination, the CRC's experienced in its fairly recent history some difficult and painful splits over the issue of women's ordination. I mean, I was in my early or late teens, early 20s when I was experiencing some of that. And I think there's a good number of people who hold to a more conservative orthodox view on marriage and human sexuality that see where a lot of churches are going in terms of becoming more affirming, more progressive, and say, we don't want to split in the same way if we come to a point where we're trying to make room for a new way of interpreting the scriptures, what I might call, or many call, a revisionist way of interpreting the scriptures, if we're trying to make room for that understanding of scripture and a more orthodox understanding, there's a number of people who feel like Sandeep just said, that's not tenable. You can't have a real unity in that kind of a situation. In denominations that have tried to do that, they've all over time continued moving towards a more progressive, affirming view. The big tent model hasn't shown to anybody that it actually works. It simply is a stepping stone, it seems, to moving towards a more progressive, affirming kind of approach. So is there a way forward for our two denominations on this issue? And I think many people realize that in terms of what does the scripture teach, we've reached a bit of an impasse. I think that's how I would put it. Those who hold to the conservative ethic feel very strongly that scripture is very clear on this. And those who are beginning in the last 20, 30 years to adopt a more affirming, we might call it a revisionist view on this, they're quite certain that these new, maybe novel ways of interpreting scripture are actually faithful. And so we've really reached an impasse. And there's many people who are saying, can we put this discussion to rest? Can we, as it were, move on, agree to disagree? The RCA a couple of years ago came up with this phrase, grace-filled separation. And I must say that caught the attention of myself, and I know a few others, wondering if that grace-filled separation, I think they're using a different term now, a mutually generous separation. Grace-filled separation and grace don't seem always to go together, but mutually generous separation, could that go in two directions? If the RCA moves to a kind of big tent, more affirming posture, and the CRC, which I think is expected, but of course uncertain, expected in 2021 to adopt a conservative view. Certainly the study committee will present that. Will Synod vote for it or not is uncertain, but most likely, I think most people feel it would be passed. But at that time, we don't, within the CRC, do we want to keep talking about it? Because undoubtedly there will be people who resist what the study committee proposes and maybe dig down and say, we got to keep talking about this for another however many years. Is there a possibility to bring the discussion in that sense to an end and allow for a mutually generous separation that is experienced in both directions? Those maybe in the CRC who lean more affirming to align with the RCA, those in the RCA who lean more conservative to align with the CRC, and do that in a generous way, a gracious way that allows for the issue to be put to rest in that sense, and each denomination then kind of stepping into the future without this discussion, this debate constantly on its agenda. I feel that there is some real possibilities in that direction, bringing this impasse to recognizing the impasse and bringing it to some end, some closure. So, yeah, the RCA wrote a letter to our two classes in BC and said, can we talk about this kind of scenario, call it a CRC-RCA realignment? Can we talk about that? And our classes just last week at its meeting agreed that this is a topic that needs discussion, and we've just approved a communication to our synod that is essentially saying this is a discussion that we're having in BC, and we think the denomination should be aware of and maybe even enter into with the RCA.
So what I hear you saying, Andrew, is that this provides a potential opportunity to, in a sense, offer churches a menu. If you decide you want to go affirming, but have in many other respects sort of a reformed tradition that acts certain ways, you could go RCA. If you wanted to maintain a traditional view of human sexuality that the church has held for a long time, you could go CRC. And that, not just that is an option, but that could even offer a way forward for churches within the denominations that could sort of settle this so that neither side would have to endure ongoing, the kinds of ongoing politicking, the likes of which we saw, let's say, over women in ecclesiastical office, and while at the same time maintaining some of the Dutch Reformed heritage in both camps. That's what I hear you saying might be the aha moment, or the real value added for this move.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
That's fair. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what do you think, Ed?
Well, I think I agree with Andrew. I think that we're looking into the future and saying we're facing a likely impasse. In all probability, the Christian Reformed Church is going to remain traditional on this if the interim report was any indication of where we're going. But there's a minority of people, I would say, in the denomination who are going to be deeply dissatisfied with maintaining a traditional position, and who are going to fight against it becoming a status confessionis, a state of confession. I think the crux for the discussion we're having today with the Reformed Church of America is, if the Christian Reformed Church does not make this a status confessionis, a statement of our confession, then I think it's going to be dubious for them to join. They're going to feel like we're going to enter into a denomination where repeated requests for dialogue are going to roll out over the next decade. I think that's the fear of a lot of CRC pastors as well that I've spoken with, and I think it harbors within my own heart that the situation we're going to be in is somewhat intractable, and we see where it's going. We've seen, as Andrew said, other denominations who have continued to answer requests for listening, for dialogue, and that kind of thing, so we can stay open on the question of where we stand as a denomination, not nail down anything because that seems uncompassionate and that kind of thing. So I think the reality for the Christian Reformed Church, however, and probably the RCA too, I'd love to see that thread Murray was talking about, is that we've really been having this discussion since the early 70s. Our initial report, which was kind of groundbreaking at the time, came out in 1973. It was the first of its kind, trying to kind of lay a foundation of what does the church believe on this. Since that time, I think there's been continued requests to revisit it. Maybe we have some new knowledge arguments that can be presented and the like of that. And I think we've seen those, we've looked at them, and really we are coming to a place where there's an ideological divide. I think there's a hermeneutical separation. That this is kind of a typifying issue, or it's a symbolic issue. I think it will have other ramifications in the way that we read Scripture, howbeit.
Okay, so how do you think on the RCA side such a move would be seen?
Well, I was going to say, Paul, there's a member of our executive in the classes who came into the RCA as a safe haven from the United Church of Canada, and so there's friends among us who are saying, "Oh no, not again! We thought the RCA would be safe haven," and I think that's why Ed is right. This has to be a go no go confessional statement. This isn't just optional. We don't want to have to switch, homes, as this slippery slope continues, because when we look at the way culture is working right now, it's not clear that there is any firm backstop. We could go further that way. I would say also that what we've experienced, I hope you're wrong, Ed, but what we've experienced is that when the RCA has made a clear statement, majority statement, there have been those who say essentially, we don't care. And when you have ordained pastors within your own family who read a statement or a position, even at a confessional level, that say, we don't care, we're in trouble. I would say that in an ideal world, this exchange of churches between the RCA and CRC could work well, those exactly the way you described, Ed, earlier. But you may find that there will be some who will say, we don't want to change denominations. We're not going to leave. We're going to stay in the CRC, and we're going to change the CRC to our moral vision. There's people like that in the RCA, I'm sorry to say. And so having a majority isn't good enough, it appears. At least that's our experience.
Yeah. Well, I think you're putting your finger on one of the things that has led us into the place where we are today, actually, is that I think it's entirely fair for people to ask questions, and it's really healthy in the Christian life to ask deep questions about deep issues. But from my understanding of the Christian Reformed Church is that when we have questions about things that we have settled, say doctrinal and ethical statements of the Christian Reformed Church, like we have had on issues of same-sex relationships and same-sex sex in particular, that there is an avenue to do that properly. So you can speak to your council to begin with, but then you can also speak to Classis, and then we take it up to Synod. I think what's been happening, however, is that there have been voices within the denomination who are asking these questions, even say in the banner, at a far more public level, and casting doubt into people's minds about what the church is teaching. And so there has been a lack of admonition, of rebuke, of discipline. And I think that's brought it to the place where we are today, where it's kind of open season on questioning church teaching, church doctrine, and that kind of thing. So I think that's part of the issue, is why we're at where we're at. And so your assessment that perchance that's where we'd go in the future makes a lot of sense to me, though it pains me to even think about that. I thought we took a vow that this is the way we would operate, and that we, if I have questions about certain things that the church teaches, then I take it to my fellow pastors and open myself up to correction and that kind of thing, or try to change the teaching of the church in those different avenues.
I before I got into YouTube, I was doing a lot of blogging, and in, I believe it was 2016, when the Christian Reformed Church was wrestling with a lot of these things, I did my best to promote what I called a confessional conversation, in that I do think that there are bigger issues beneath the surface about questions about what is scripture, what is revelation, what is the church, how these things interface with propositional belief, many of the systems that we use to sort of organize ourselves and regulate ourselves and to form a body, making an issue like this to forego the Latin a go no go confessional point. This would have pretty significant ramifications, in that in many ways our confessional machinery has been allowed to basically sit at a distance, a several 100-year distance, and say, well, we can't really touch these documents. And just lately in the Christian Reformed Church, we added a new layer of contemporary testimony that's kind of between them. At this point in the Christian Reformed Church, the 1973 report and the subsequent reports in the Christian Reformed Church sort of are church teaching, but when someone signs the covenant of office bearers, they don't necessarily sign onto a position with respect to human sexuality. If that becomes something that they subscribe to, that would then also within the Christian Reformed Church have significant ramifications and might in fact, might in fact initiate some of this, let's say, a clarifying movement that I think Andrew is sort of envisioning in terms of, well, here's a menu of options. If if you believe this, you'd be in this bucket. If you believe that, you'd be in that bucket. So in other words, one possible opportunity and solution might also have significant opportunities and consequences even within the Christian Reformed Church that might, for example, be necessary for certain members of these RCA churches to say, if we're going to join the Christian Reformed Church, this needs to have confessional status. So, this is whereas we might look at this as sort of a pragmatic step forward, but very quickly one might see it as, well, this is a rather, on the part of the Christian Reformed Church, in fact, this would require a pretty substantial commitment and perhaps change, even in a denomination that we say, well, we are, it's often said that the Reformed Church of America has a constitution, whereas is constitutional, whereas opposed to the Christian Reformed Church is confessional. So, in some ways, one might look at this conversation and say, oh, this is sort of a pragmatic sorting out of things, and people can say side A or side B. But when we get to questions about, okay, we're going to have a confessional conversation here and make some confessional commitments, these things go deep.
Well, friends, I would rather be in a confessional denomination than a constitutional organization. I know I'm online and people will hear that. But I would say this to my Christian Reformed brothers. I'm part of a mission agency that has, for 25 years, every year, I sign a statement of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. I physically sign, I believe this statement of faith. Nothing has changed in the last 365 days. I still believe it. I agree with this Christian lifestyle. Nothing has changed in the last 365, and I sign it again. I've signed it 25 times in 25 years. I'm not sure that I want to go to a denomination that doesn't have some kind of backstop. And I think that even though that's a parachurch mechanism to maintain its identity and focus, I think that denominations that are being formed today may need to take something like that, because what I've seen is a slide. People change their mind a little bit in 1 year, and then they change their mind a little bit more the next year and the next year. And they may not have changed their mind in one day, but over a period of time, they have indeed turned 180 degrees. Whereas if you limit it, it's an issue of integrity, that when you sign this year, again, yes, I believe this. We need some kind of backstop like that. That's what I would ask for if we were to join you, Christian Reformed friends.
Well, and I think it raises an interesting question from my perspective when you start asking about the culture of the denomination, the culture of our denomination, and whether or not we do have within us a culture of discipline for thought and for what you think. I think that even if I think of a lot of the examinations that I've had, I think we're still reacting against kind of a rigid orthodoxy that kind of characterized the church in its early years, and sometimes over peripheral matters rather than central matters. I don't know if this is the reality, but it would become of supreme importance whether you were supralapsarian or infralapsarian and those kind of things. And so I think there was a generation of pastors that were in the pulpit when I was growing up who really just wanted to preach a message of grace and of the love of God and kind of move away from the 3-point doctrinal sermons. And we also moved away from a culture, therefore, of holding one another accountable to our doctrine. So that would be a question I would ask you guys is, do you think that in the Christian Reformed Church we have this culture or could we recover that culture of holding people accountable to their theology?
just the video that I just finished making, I told a story of, it was a family story where a young woman in the Christian Reformed Church found herself with child out of wedlock. The family stopped attending church. The elders were coming to the door wondering why the family was not, was not participating in the means of grace. And the first thing out of the mother's mouth when the elders showed up was, "We joined the RCA." and so, there's a little bit of history between the denominations along these lines. As Murray said, there was open communion versus closed communion. Now, a lot of what's been happening in the Christian Reformed Church over the years has been, at least south of the border, we would call it an Americanization, a broader influence of, let's say, American evangelicalism in one side of the church, but also more mainline influence in another side of the church. And so we've seen a lot of this migration happening. That's been very subtle. Someone might argue that the difference between infralapsarian and supralapsarian might in fact come to bear on this question of human sexuality in terms of what God intended for the scriptures. So and then there's a whole lot of people who would say, all this theological talk, all this policing individuals' personal lives, all of this stuff, why don't we just get back to the basics of sharing the gospel of Jesus so people can have an assurance of salvation and not worry about what they're doing with their bodies? So, and that of course connects with other ancient things. So there's a lot going on here, and which is part of the reason why I, have advocated for, which I think we're having at the moment, a confessional conversation where we're beginning to ask deeper questions. But now this also facing, I think, what I hear coming from Andrew, which is that the time for talking is done. We see the two camps. Let's cut the talking. Let's be done with this. Let's get on with the work of the church. If you're affirming, you go here. If you're traditional, you go there. And see, I don't know that that's exactly. So I'm trying to figure out what conversation we're trying to have, and then the way forward.
I guess in some sense, what this CRCRCA realignment issue might be for the church is as strange as it may sound, a different way of expressing unity in the church. In the CRC, we were when we were going through the women's ordination issue, we ended up splitting off, creating new denominations. And often that has historically been the case. Denominations split and then new ones start and the new ones start. But here we have two denominations that have a history of working together. We share a lot of doctrine and world and life view. But at this moment in history, we seem to be coming to different conclusions on this issue. And maybe within this new reality, there could be a new way of presenting unity in the church, where we in a mutually generous way, say, we don't agree on this issue, and for the sake of the mission of the church, we want to put the discussion to rest. There may still be ways, I'm sure there would be, for an affirming RCA and a traditional CRC to continue working together at some level, continue joint ministry in some way, but at least on this issue of how do we understand human sexuality in marriage, we're moving now to a new way of being together where we're not debating it anymore. So it's probably more pragmatic in its nature, but I think that there is a lot of wisdom for the sake of the congregations, for the sake of many people in the pew. So many people in the CRC, like myself, when it comes to the issue of how to pastorally embrace people who have same-sex attraction. We're not even having those conversations because we're talking in two different ways about how to show the love of Christ and bring the gospel into the life of people who experience sexual brokenness. We're talking in two different ways, and it's hard to really, from a traditional view, give good, meaningful pastoral care when there's contingents in your same denomination that are saying something quite different about what it means to be gay and how, you know, God created you that way. And so I think we're at a point where we want to kind of say, we agree to disagree. We'll try to bless each other as we take a different path and move on. And hopefully this would be a way for us as a CRC, when we deal with this again in 2021, to think, you know, do we want to keep having this conversation? Can we do something that, whether it's like a status confessionis, do something to kind of bring the discussion to an end within our denomination? Mm-hmm. So.
And Paul, I'm just wondering, are you asking the denomination to determine, in a sense, or that we have to have a discussion about whether or not this should be a matter of confession, or whether it is more a matter of teaching that can be taken more secondarily? Like, so I'm just wondering what kind of discussion you think we might have when you say we've got to start this confessional discussion. I agree, but are we trying to settle the question as to whether it should be confessional? One of the mandates in the Human Sexuality Committee for the Christian Reformed Church right now is to evaluate that very question. Should this be a matter that is confessional? In other words, what do you envision and see is fundamentally at stake in this, in coming on one side or on the other side? And I think that's where a lot of the divide is. Some people think it's a matter of adiaphora, we can disagree, agree to disagree perpetually, and others of us think, no, actually, this is really critical. The gospel is at stake.
You know, I pull back. I see both. I think in some ways this issue is forcing us to look at deeper questions of how confessions actually function with respect to the church. Mm-hmm. And, you know, Murray's observation now of, you know, every year, you know, re-signing his beliefs, re-signing his practices. There's a church in Tucson that I just visited, pastored by a commissioned pastor in the CRC on loan to that church. He planted it, where they, for example, have their membership is yearly. Every year they're called to covenant to, and then very similar to what Murray just laid out. I was, for the video that I just in fact made when I was messing up the time and delaying you guys, I actually did a fair amount of thinking about John Sook and his book, Not Sure, and I in fact read a little something that I highlighted from his book when I had read it a number of years ago. He's asking much deeper questions about how, whether the traditional alignment that we have used in order to form community still actually functions the way we want it to. Mm. The confessional machinery is something that's about, you know, it's basically after the Protestant Reformation, this was a way to help communities form around their beliefs. I think there were some interesting questions about how these beliefs in fact actually function with respect to our communities. And so there are a number of broad questions at work. But at the same time, I'm a pastor of a church and a member of a classis and a denomination. And I also know you can't just be talking about these things forever. So I understand Andrew's point, but I also understand that saying to my elders and deacons, okay, the CRC is going to interpret, let's say, the Heidelberg Catechism, certain question and answer, to define human sexuality in this way. So when you become a deacon, you are not only going to be subscribing to, and we always tend to shortlist these things, infant baptism, a number of things that we forefront and hide in the back. human sexuality is part of this. This is what you're saying when you're a deacon in the Christian Reformed Church. That would be it would be very interesting watching that conversation take place, because at this point, I think a lot of that confessional machinery is old, and what a lot of parachurches, for example, have done is say, well, here's some behaviors and here's some, we have a short list. So I see this as a very big issue. And I love to see the conversation, because as I think we're seeing now, it goes in a lot of different places, and there are very definite practical short-term things that we have to deal with, but also far bigger issues that we're wrestling with. And I fully appreciate the folks from the RCA saying, hey, our denomination has been chewing at each other for a very long time over this, and it's in the way of actually being able to do anything else. Is there a place we can go to live within ecclesiastical community and function productively? I'm sympathetic to that too. So
yeah,
I'm very open, but I see a lot of, this is a big deal.
Andrew, the issue that you raised, the pastoral issue, is the one that I've been chomping at the bit to get to, but you can't get there unless you agree whether this is something to be celebrated or repented of. If you don't have agreement on that, how are you going to move to the pastoral side? And there is so much, I think we know a little about how to help a couple that has been devastated by adultery. I think we know a bit about the pastoral part of that. How about pornography? Folks, if the stats are right, we've got the vast majority of the guys in our churches who have either experimented or are hooked in some way. And we're not talking about that very much. All of us have people who have some measure, or some people who have some same-sex attraction or sexual confusion or something like that. But we need to have a conversation about how we pastorally move through. Let's say we agree on this and it's not going to change. Do we understand, well, how do we provide pastoral care to people with sexual confusion or same-sex attraction, pornography, helping people through adultery? There's a lot of sexual issues that are swirling around our culture beyond these same-sex behavior issues, and we need to have time and energy for them. Because if we only say this is right and this is wrong, but we don't go beyond that, then we're also not fully representing the gospel. So I'm eager for that kind of conversation, Andrew. I think we need to talk about pastoral approaches a lot more in a lot more depth.
Last fall, our church, together with Sandeep's congregation and another Christian Reformed church here in Burnaby, the three of our churches, we had a series of Sunday evening teaching services on human sexuality and marriage, and but we presented that. We invited another CRC pastor by the name of Mary Lee Bauma. She was the key speaker, and we kind of grounded it in the traditional understanding of marriage and human sexuality, which opened up the possibility to talk about this pastorally in, I think, quite helpful ways. People's response to that series was, it's good to hear us have confidence in what the scriptures teach, and out of that confidence, be able to extend the love of Christ and the power of the gospel in tangible, meaningful ways, But if you're in a climate where, as Murray said, if you're in a climate where there's people, pastors or others in the church that are approaching this very differently and saying, your sexual identity is something to be celebrated and expressed, then you've lost the ability really to do good pastoral care. It becomes very challenging. It's confusing for people in the congregations because they're not sure what approach to take. So I think, that's another reason to bring the discussion, so to speak, or the debate to an end, and allow the churches to live out carefully what they really believe is a core biblical teaching.
So I've got to be careful in how I state this, but I was part of an organization who was asking the question about policies within this organization regarding issues of human sexuality and the like of that. And the board was apprehensive to make any kind of statement of belief about where we stand. And they wanted to remain neutral on the question. And then launched a committee to discuss how we were going to assess the needs of this organization, and then to develop a policy from a neutral perspective. And I objected strenuously to this subcommittee because we have to know what game we're playing if we're going to decide what the rules of the game are. And if you don't have a position, it is unbelievably difficult to decide what your policies are going to be. In other words, how you're going to demonstrate love to somebody who comes out with same-sex attraction in the first instance, but then same-sex behavior in the other instance. Exactly as Murray said, do I affirm that and affirm their newfound identity for discovering their true self? Or do I say, no, your identity is in Christ, and true freedom is sometimes abstaining from certain behaviors. And we're in a moment of a cultural tsunami, you know, those kind of things. And to do this in all compassion. So I'm just underscoring what you guys are saying and the profound difficulty we have if we're going to say, let's just say that all positions are viable here. I don't think it is. I don't think we can go down that road.
So where does this, I mean, to me, there are, you know, part of the Gospel Alliance question is an interesting one because, you know, a certain group of churches that are interested in a sense, as I look at them, sort of founding the Willow Creek Association RCA version, let's say, because it's not just, you know, churches are not just these plain things. Churches themselves come in varieties of diversity. Having an entire RCA Classis decide to join, and now there are 2 CRC Classis in British Columbia, and you'd have to figure out exactly how that would work. That would be a pretty significant move in terms of denominations, people watching each other. You know, have you thought about what this might look like? I mean, what are the kinds of things that your churches would need to say to the CRC, or conditions, or and on the CRC side, such a move, and I very much expect that even posting this conversation for some people will elicit a response, maybe a strong one, because the idea that conservative congregations from the Reformed Church of America are going to increase the number of conservative congregations in the Christian Reformed Church that are against a wave of affirming, well, some of these Christian Reformed congregations might not feel so happy about moving into the RCA themselves. They've had Christian Reformed identity for years, and relationships and networks and so on. I mean, even practically and politically, what are your thoughts on how this thing plays out? Especially, I mean, I don't understand the Canadian context that well. I do know that it's in many ways different from the American context. And now at a moment when it seems that binationality is suddenly a rather, maybe not suddenly, a rather hot issue in our denomination right now. So there's a lot of moving pieces here.
Well, I would say something that's developing in Canada is actually initiated by the government on a totally different basis, and that has to do with money laundering. So they want denominations to be able to control the funds that go outside of the borders of Canada. And when we send money to the CRC sends money to Kalamazoo Avenue in Grand Rapids, or we send money to the US, the Canadian government is saying, hey, how do you know the money is going to be used? You don't have control over the money, and so we don't like that. So there's going to be pressure the Canadian Revenue Service for each of our respective denominations to sever formal ties or organizational ties or accountability ties with the U.S. And that will give opportunity, if we want to, for the Reformed and Christian Reformed Church in Canada to reconstitute itself organizationally with the Canadian Revenue Agency. And there's probably other biblically orthodox denominations who have ties to the U.S. who are getting the same letter from the Canadian Revenue Agency.
Well,
wow. So in other words, this could go beyond the CRC. We could have a United Reformed Church of Canada, and that's a big statement. That's interesting.
I don't know where it'll go, but that's the trend line.
one of the things that came out of the discussion that we recently had at our Classis, this is Classis BC Northwest, as I said earlier, we're sending a communication to Synod, and part of that communication is that Synod be encouraged to allow its senior denominational staff to begin discussions with their counterparts in the RCA around this realignment option, so that we, at that level, say the Regional Synod of Canada and the RCA, the director of the Canadian Regional Synod talking to maybe the Canadian Ministries director, and at that level beginning to have conversation about, okay, so if something like this were to happen, some RCA churches maybe coming into the CRC and perhaps some CRC churches transferring to the RCA, what would that look like, and how could that be done in an orderly way? We do have a number of differences, and so how do we sort through those things for the denominational staff even to be able to start talking that way? Now, some will say, oh, this is very premature, but sometimes having some options in front of you when you're facing significant decisions like what we'll face in 2021, having options is a way for, helps in terms of charting another way forward. So I think there would be some wisdom in allowing, even at the denominational level, at senior staff level, to begin talking about this possibility together with counterparts of the RCA. Because there's a lot of questions, as you said, Paul. There's going to be a lot of open issues, and how do we deal with ministry shares versus assessments? And the percentage that CRC churches pay to ministry shares is considerably higher than what the RCA churches pay to their equivalent. But there's certainly ways to figure that out, I'm sure. So
I think one of the other realities here is, our friend Jordan Peterson likes to talk about the level of resolution you're looking at something, right, Paul? And I think one of the discoveries I'm making is that when I kind of close down the lens and look closer up, this comes down to the individual church level. I mean, in our body, I am well aware that not everybody agrees on this issue. Even though I have a very firm stance, and it's well known what I believe about these things, and I feel that I'm duty bound, in fact, in the denomination to teach what our denomination teaches, and I wouldn't teach anything contrary to it, that kind of thing. Even if I did believe otherwise, I wouldn't. But what we realize as a church is we're going to have this discussion in-house, and we would have to say, yes, as a church, as a majority, we are deciding that we are going to draw a line in the sand when it comes to the traditional perspective, or perhaps it goes the other way and they say we're going to be a church that's actually quote unquote progressive on this. And so I think that those kind of discussions need to start happening already. So when I hear people saying, it's too soon to have this discussion at the denominational level, I'm somewhat sympathetic to it. But it may prompt individual churches to start looking into the future and going, my goodness, we actually are going to have this very difficult, very painful discussion at the level of the local church, and decide, are we going to be this, or are we going to be that? Are we going to affirm this, or going to affirm that? So I think that's kind of some of the next steps for some of our churches. Some churches have already decided this, but I know many of us have been kind of hoping that the very uncomfortable discussions and the pain that surrounds all of this might just go away. It's not going away.
But it is a question of polity. Do we have a Presbyterian form of polity, or do we have a congregational form of polity? Because if it's going to be at the local congregation level, then we have a congregational level of polity, whether we want to admit it or not. And you're right, it will tear some congregations apart. Not every controversial issue has to be decided from the ground up when we are in a covenantal relationship.
Well, I would, with this issue, my position has for a long time been that it's connected to deeper things. Now, how exactly and what these deeper things are, I don't think a lot of people pay much attention to. And I've just been, just even in the context of this conversation, it's been quite eye-opening in terms of the breadth to which something like the consequences of these kinds of moves could have. Yet at the same time, as I think I hear all parties saying, doing nothing doesn't work either. So it's fascinating listening to you all have this conversation. When do you think, is this something that your classis in the RCA is saying, here's a date that we want to decide this by, or these are preliminary conversations and let's see how it goes? What's sort of on your menu of options before you?
I think for at least the basic classes, we've started this conversation a few years ago, right? And I think partly that's helping us just be open and prepared rather than being caught by surprise, reactionary, which could happen for many people if they're not thinking from now, what are the possible options there. I think some of the conversation that we've started having have been out of natural relationships that we already have with the people within this group. So I don't think there's a timeline necessarily for this CRC-RCA alignment kind of an option. Though for the BC classes, it's a timeline of, I believe, 2 more years, Murray?
Yeah, we're most of the way through a 5-year.
Yeah.
We started the clock ticking in a 5-year period. We said we're not going to let this go indefinitely. If the RCA doesn't hold to its own standards, we will leave within 5 years.
And so that also, like I said, gave us time to talk about these options and also have some input into what's going on in the denomination, whether it's through the delegates that have gone for the General Synod or just in this ad hoc committee. So I don't see a timeline unless I think a significant maybe group of people from the other side, like from the CRC side, say, let's possibly work on a timeline. So that's kind of, I think, my understanding.
Well,
but we're not,
guys...
sorry,
go ahead.
It's not like, I don't think there's any pressuring of, the CRC to have to do this. I mean, you don't have to, in a sense, engage in this conversation, but we know that you will be also facing similar things shortly. And this was the most likely kind of, as I mentioned before, sister denomination that we could, we've already been working together on different things. We could start this conversation and see what happens. And also for, hopefully it helps some of those in the CRC who are concerned about the future, start thinking maybe along with us on this line.
One of the things that our classes decided was to appoint a small team that would begin conversation kind of a bit more formally with representatives from Classis BC of the RCA. I mean, we're responding to their letter because they did send us a letter. And in that letter, they asked that we enter into discussion on a possible future together. And so we at our classes have decided to appoint a team that will, on behalf of classes, begin meeting with representatives from Classis BC of the RCA. And I don't know where that will go, quite honestly, but I could imagine that out of that meeting could come some more concrete ways of seeing a union come together. Maybe that then gets communicated to the denomination, maybe to next year's synod or to other representatives in the denomination. Just, here's a collection of churches in both denominations that have been having this conversation, and here's a way forward that we could see for us coming together. So yeah, I think that will be one place where some of these discussions are going to become pretty, where the rubber is going to hit the road, so to speak, on a potential way forward and what a merger could look like or a realignment could look like.
How about your classes, Ed? Have you guys received the letter, and what's the status in your neck of the woods?
Yeah, we received a letter as well. And the decision of our classes was encouraging us to have discussions like we're having right now, to have it more between fellow pastors, have it with your council, that kind of thing. But the classes doesn't want to formally engage in it just yet at this point. So there's still more to be done there, perhaps. I think just to express my own desire for meeting today, it was really to get this discussion out there and see hopefully what light can be shed. There's a lot of different perspectives, and I'd love to hear them and see what people are thinking, see what kind of solutions we're envisioning for the future, because we really do need to start having this discussion. For us, 2021 is a big year, and I think there are a lot of people who are coming to a tipping point on both sides. So it behooves us to engage in these sorts of discussions, even when they're difficult, even when, as Sandeep was saying earlier, they'll cause in us a kind of anticipatory grieving to know that we are going to lose something come the future, because I think we've already lost something in the recent past.
Well, and my confessional conversations, a lot of people assume that when I mention this, I want an outcome. When I watched the Christian Reformed Church try to process the Belhar, I thought, we have no idea how to facilitate conversations of this magnitude in our midst. I think in years past, the Christian Reformed Church had a lot of relational connections that facilitated conversations, so that when things came to the meeting in the room, well, there's a lot that was going on. There's a whole ecosystem around that meeting in the room conversation. Today, the context is so radically different that far more basic questions such as, what is church? What is a form of subscription? What is church discipline? How do we hold each other accountable? Against what do we? Towards what ends? And even I really appreciated the raising the question of, if you don't have a basic answer for what does sexual flourishing look like, you can't make any application in our diverse context at all. And so, you know, I think that's a strong point, that at such a basic level, churches need to at least be on the same page and saying, this is our telos, this is what we're shooting for in terms of what we say sexual fulfillment is, or sexual shalom. Because right now there are so many things on the menu that it becomes sexual shalom is what feels good for you right now. Now, any of us who have traveled through any time at all know that's a bad answer. Because, so, and the church, in fact, part of what it needs to do is provide answers for this. Now, again, there might be menus. One church says, this is what shalom looks like. The other says that. And people might come to there as consumers. We haven't even talked about a consumerist ethos. So there's a lot on the table here. But I'm talking too much because I want to facilitate your conversation. So go ahead.
Well, Paul, when you talk about, you know, the deeper things that we need to be discussing, I do think about the cultural realities that we're in right now, and the unseen forces that are leading us to certain conclusions in unspoken ways. You know, you think about the postmodernity and the effects of postmodernity and the way it has relativized our understanding of truth, and the various cultural liturgies, to pick up Smith's language, that we are just, they're the air we breathe. We haven't been questioning them very much, and we need to start questioning these things. The role that media and television has played in contouring our moral sensibilities. So the question of moral taste needs to be asked. And these are some of the deeper questions I think would be really helpful to ask. You think about expressive individualism, where I am because I can express myself. It's not the Descartesian I am because I think, but it's rather I am because I can express myself and be true to who I am. Or moral therapeutic deism. It's about feeling good. And doesn't God want us to be happy, for goodness sake? So all of those cultural realities, but then the theological underpinnings as well, is we need to have some robust conversation about our doctrine of creation, about our doctrine of sin. I think we've lost a kind of foundational doctrine of sin and of salvation then. So all of these things for me come into the orbit, or actually maybe are underlying the question of same-sex relationships, human flourishing around sexual questions.
We've gone, I just figured out why I was wrong on time. Do you guys have a daylight savings time? Oh, so maybe yep. I just had it wrong. I don't know. I thought maybe you, maybe our clock is different. So
we just switched on, what is it, Sunday morning?
Oh, okay. So that's no excuse for me. I just messed up. So yeah, we've talked a little while, and I've sort of been trying to prompt this, but anything that I haven't been able to prompt here that you all want to get on the table, because again, I think a lot of people will see this, and this will be for a number of people the first time about hearing that, in fact, there are serious conversations going on about realignment between the denominations, and there is, on the part of some, a desire to promote a serious conversation about this. Again, this will have consequences in the minds of some, especially if things start happening, because talk is cheap. But if a group of churches that do not intend to affirm join the Christian Reformed Church, that obviously those who are head counting in the Christian Reformed Church about its future, you know, these things get people excited one way or another. So any other aspects that I haven't thought of that y'all want to bring out into the fore?
I think the only thing I would add is, in response to the question, who should be talking to each other, I would like to see regional synod heads talk to each other informally about this. In each denomination, regional synod leaders get together to talk about other things. I don't know what they talk about. I'm not one of them, but I know they have counterparts in the other denomination, and it would be so easy, or comparatively easy, for those denominational counterparts in respective regional synods to have conversation about the suitability of this kind of movement, gracious movement between denominations. It would have to be voluntary, I think. I mean, there's a number of practical challenges that are part of it, but I think in terms of who else should be having this conversation, or who should be having this conversation next, I would encourage regional synod heads in the two denominations to it's just coffee shop talk, but that's where it starts and should take place.
We don't really have regional synods in the CRC. They're probably talking to denominational employees that are coordinating with them with respect to certain ministry areas, but in the CRC, we didn't go the route of regional synods.
Okay, well,
so that's
just showing my ignorance
that's
of the way
okay.
the organization goes, but there must be somewhat, you know, you can talk formally in a synod with, you know, that's been called to order and is making decisions, but you can also have informal conversations, and I think that's what I'm suggesting.
Over the last 10 years, there have been a variety of programs that the CRC and the RCA have done together. I was very active with the Kingdom Enterprise Zone Project, the Reformed Leadership Initiative Project, and there have been a number of other things like that. In some ways, the denominations have never been closer than they are now. So I think there are real opportunities. For example, Classis, Arizona has the RCA and the CRC have continued to work deeply together. When I was doing the Kingdom Enterprise Zone and Reformed Leadership Initiative, our two classes in Central California worked closely together. So there's never been a time that the two denominations have been closer. Now, again, politically, that plays differently in both denominations, because for many people, this issue on one side or the other is a defining issue. And so it's a big deal. But part of the reason I wanted to do this on my channel is I do want to be able to continue to use my channel for the sake of the Christian Reformed Church, which, you know, I'm very much a part of, to facilitate conversations. And so I do want to have more conversations like this on my channel. You know, there's a lot to talk about. And I think if we're going to have confessional conversations, we're going to need to use YouTube, social media in order to facilitate it. But I tend to think that Twitter and Facebook and Instagram probably aren't the platforms. That something longer form like YouTube probably holds more promise to get at a lot of what we need to talk about.
If I could make one more plug, I think it's been said before, but you know, within the CRC, we want to ask ourselves what's next after 2021. You know, what are we done with the issue, or is it just and does that just begin a new chapter of more dialogue and more listening and more? And I think the issue has really come to an impasse, you know, and how can we agree, okay, this way of reading scripture is hermeneutically quite different than this way of reading scripture. We're not here to convince each other. We're not drawing battle lines around the issue anymore. We're trying to find a way beyond that. And I think that this is one way that perhaps, you know, our two denominations can get beyond that. And so, yeah, hopefully, like has been said, this little conversation will inspire and encourage broader conversations as well.
How can people get in touch with you all if they want to further this, or what is a way that people can engage in this conversation if they want to? Obviously, in the comment section below, all of you, I will put links to you should all send me a link that you'd like in the notes below, and I'll put them down. Could be to your church. You don't necessarily have to put your YouTube or your email address on the YouTube comment if you don't want to. You just put the church website. Usually there's a way to contact you through it. Twitter handles, anything like that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's fine.
Does that sound good?
Yep,
No
that
problem.
sounds fine.
All right. Well, thank you all for your time and for giving me the opportunity to host this. And we'll let some time go by and we'll see what happens. Obviously, General Synod 2020 for the RCA isn't long from now. And I think, depending on what happens there, we might have more to talk about.
Yep. Thanks for hosting us, Paul.
My pleasure. Stay on the line. I'll end the recording and we can wrap up then.